The rope was already hanging in the morning wind when the cowboy stepped out of the crowd and said one quiet word. No, the town of Dry Creek had gathered early that day, boots in the dust, hats pulled low against the rising Arizona sun, the kind of morning when the air smelled like dry wood and horse leather and something else, judgment. Folks stood shoulder to shoulder around the wooden platform in the center of the square, whispering to each other with the heavy certainty that comes when a crowd decides it already knows the truth. In the middle of it all stood a young native woman with dark hair tied loosely at the back of her neck and tired eyes that had clearly traveled more miles than most people in Dry Creek ever would. Her name was Ayanna Redbird, though almost no one there cared enough to ask it. To them, she was simply trouble that had wandered into town before sunrise. The sheriff stood nearby with his thumbs hooked in his belt, glancing from the crowd to the girl and back again, like a man who wished the whole business would finish itself without him needing to think too hard about it. A few townsfolk muttered words under their breath, things about stolen horses, outsiders, and how people like her always brought problems with them. No one mentioned proof. No one asked questions. The wind creaked softly against the beam above the platform, and somewhere down the street a loose sign knocked against a wooden wall. Then the cowboy stepped forward. Ethan Caldwell had arrived in Dry Creek 3 days earlier with nothing more than a saddlebag, a worn hat, and the kind of calm silence that made people wonder where he'd come from. He wasn't the loudest man in a room, and he never rushed his words, but when he moved through the crowd that morning, people stepped aside without quite realizing why. His boots stopped a few feet from the platform. Dust swirled around his heels as he looked up at the girl, then at the rope swaying gently overhead, then slowly across the faces of the town that had already made up its mind. Someone in the back scoffed. Another voice muttered, "Don't tell me that Drifter's about to defend her." Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for the revolver resting quiet at his hip. He simply tipped his hat back a fraction so the sun lit his eyes and said, calm as desert wind, "No." The word carried farther than anyone expected. The murmuring stopped. Even the sheriff straightened slightly, unsure whether to be annoyed or relieved. Ethan nodded once toward the girl. "That rope doesn't belong there," he said. "And neither does she." For a moment, the entire square fell into the kind of silence that only happens when a single man says something 100 others are afraid to question. Then the whispers returned, louder this time, sharper, spreading through the crowd like a brush fire through dry grass. One man laughed bitterly. Another shook his head. Someone near the saloon porch spat into the dirt and said, "Looks like the cowboy's chosen his side." Ethan Caldwell didn't answer. He simply stood there, shoulders square, watching the town of Dry Creek slowly turn its eyes toward him instead. The silence did not last long in Dry Creek because a town that has already chosen its truth does not welcome a man who questions it. The murmurs rolled across the square like wind across dry prairie grass, quiet at first, and then louder as more people found courage inside the safety of a crowd. Ethan Caldwell remained where he stood, boots planted in the dust, his gaze moving slowly from face to face, as if he were counting who had already decided he was wrong. Sheriff Cole Harper cleared his throat and stepped forward a few inches, the silver star on his vest catching the morning light. He was not a cruel man by nature, but he was the kind who preferred peace over truth, and peace in a small town often meant agreeing with the loudest voices. He looked from Ethan to the young native woman standing on the platform and back again, clearly wishing the cowboy had never spoken. "Caldwell," the sheriff said slowly, choosing his words the way a man chooses steps across thin ice, "this is town business." Ethan tipped his head slightly. Justice is everybody's business. That answer did not please the crowd. A rancher near the front crossed his arms and shook his head. Another man laughed without humor. Someone else muttered that outsiders always thought they knew better than the people who built the place. Ethan heard it all and did not respond. Instead, his eyes lifted toward the young woman again. Up close, he could see the dust along the hem of her travel dress, and the way her shoulders held the quiet tension of someone who had been walking for many miles without rest. Her eyes met his only once before drifting toward the ground again, not with shame, but with the weary caution of someone who had learned that speaking rarely changed what strangers believed. Sheriff Harper rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. "Girl," he said, his voice louder now so the crowd could hear, "you were seen near the north pasture before sunrise. That is where the missing horse belonged. The crowd shifted, boots grinding against the dirt street as heads nodded in agreement. Ethan raised one hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to slow the rush of judgment moving through the square. Seen near a pasture is not the same thing as stealing from it, he said evenly. The rancher who had spoken earlier stepped forward half a step, his face red from the heat and the growing anger of a man who felt challenged in front of his neighbors. You calling this town a liar, cowboy? Ethan answered without raising his voice. I am saying a person deserves more than whispers before a rope is chosen. The words hung in the air like dust suspended in sunlight. No one spoke for a moment. Even the wind seemed to pause against the wooden buildings that lined the square. Then someone near the back of the crowd spat into the street and said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Looks like the drifter cares more about her than he does about the people here. A ripple of agreement spread outward. Sheriff Harper glanced at Ethan again, his expression tightening as if he already understood what would happen next. Because in a small town, the moment a man stands between the crowd and its certainty, he stops being part of the town at all. The crowd did not need long to decide what to do with a man who refused to stand with them. It began with the looks first. Not loud anger, not shouting, just the slow turning of faces and the quiet closing of distance that made it clear Ethan Caldwell had stepped somewhere the town did not want him to stand. The rancher near the front gave a dry laugh and shook his head as though he had just watched a man make the worst mistake of his life. You picked a strange hill to stand on, cowboy, he said. This town protects its own. Ethan did not move. Dust drifted across the square in thin lines as the morning sun climbed higher above the rooftops. Somewhere a horse snorted near the hitching rail and a loose wagon chain rattled softly in the breeze. Small sounds, ordinary sounds, but in that moment they seemed louder than the voices around them. Ethan looked at the people of Dry Creek again, one by one, the way a man studies a landscape before riding into it. Some faces were angry. Others looked uncertain. A few avoided his eyes completely. Sheriff Cole Harper shifted his weight and let out a slow breath that carried more fatigue than authority. Ethan, he said quietly, no longer using the cowboy's last name. You came through here peaceful. I would rather see you leave the same way. Ethan tipped his head slightly, as if he understood the warning behind those words. You asking me to walk away? The sheriff hesitated. The pause told the crowd everything. One of the townsmen folded his arms and called out. He should be grateful we are giving him the chance. A few others murmured their agreement. Ethan turned his head slightly toward the platform again. The young woman still stood there, silent, her hands resting loosely at her sides, as if she had already accepted that the town had decided her story for her. For a moment Ethan simply watched the wind lift a strand of her dark hair. Then he looked back at the sheriff. What is her name? He asked. The question caught the crowd off guard. Sheriff Harper blinked once. What? Her name? Ethan repeated calmly. You are about to pass judgment on someone, and nobody here even bothered to ask it. The square fell quiet again. A few men shifted their boots against the ground. Finally the girl spoke, her voice steady but soft from long miles of travel. Ayanna, she said. Ayanna Redbird. The name moved through the crowd like something unfamiliar. Ethan nodded once, slow and respectful. Miss Redbird, he said. Then he turned back toward the townspeople. Now at least we know who we are talking about. The rancher scoffed loudly. A name does not change what she did. Ethan met the man's stare without raising his voice. No, he said calmly. But it reminds us, she is a person. The wind creaked against the wooden beam above the platform again, and somewhere in the distance a church bell rang once for the hour. Sheriff Harper rubbed his jaw and looked across the gathered faces, realizing something the crowd had not yet noticed. The moment Ethan Caldwell asked for the girl's name, the story in Dry Creek had already begun to change. And the town did not like that feeling at all. The name lingered in the dry morning air longer than anyone expected. Ayanna Redbird. It was a simple thing, just 2 words, but in a town like Dry Creek, even a name could disturb the order people preferred. For a few seconds no one spoke. The crowd shifted uneasily, boots scraping the dust, men glancing at one another as if unsure why the square suddenly felt less certain than it had moments earlier. Then the rancher who had spoken before stepped forward again, his patience clearly thinning under the weight of Ethan Caldwell's calm refusal to step aside. His name was Victor Hale, a man who owned more land around Dry Creek than anyone else, and who rarely needed to raise his voice for people to listen. But this time he did. "We are not here to discuss names," he said sharply. "We are here because a horse was taken, and she was the only outsider near the pasture before sunrise." His words carried easily through the crowd, and many nodded again, grateful to hear something that restored the simple version of the story they had already accepted. Ethan did not turn toward him immediately. Instead, he glanced once more at Ayanna. The young woman met his eyes for a brief moment, and something passed there that the crowd could not quite read. It was not fear. It was not gratitude either. It was something steadier, the quiet recognition that one stranger had chosen to see her as more than a problem that needed to disappear before lunch. Ethan finally looked toward Victor Hale. "You own the pasture?" he asked. Victor folded his arms slowly. "That horse belonged to my ranch, yes." "Then you must have seen her take it." Victor's expression tightened slightly, just enough for Sheriff Harper to notice. "My ranch hands saw her near the fence line," Victor answered. "That is enough." Ethan shook his head once. "It is not enough to end a person's road." The words were not loud, but they moved through the crowd with the same quiet weight his first word had carried earlier. Several townsfolk exchanged glances again. Doubt was not something that visited Dry Creek often, but when it did, it arrived in small pieces like this. Sheriff Harper cleared his throat and stepped forward, trying to gather control of the moment before it slipped too far from his hands. "Ethan," he said, his voice careful again, "this town has rules. People here trust the word of those who have built this place." Ethan nodded slowly. "Trust is earned," he said, "but so is truth." A man near the saloon porch muttered that the cowboy had been in town barely 3 days and already spoke like a preacher. Another man laughed under his breath, though the sound did not carry the confidence it had earlier. Victor Hale watched the shift in the crowd with narrowing eyes. He had built his reputation in Dry Creek over many years, and he knew exactly how quickly certainty could slip away once someone started asking the wrong questions. So he stepped closer to the platform and raised his voice just enough to cut through the murmuring. "This drifter does not belong here," he said firmly. "And if he prefers the company of outsiders, perhaps he should ride out with them." The crowd quieted again, waiting to see what Ethan Caldwell would do next. But Ethan did not move toward the road. Instead, he looked around the square once more, meeting the eyes of men who had known Victor Hale for years and yet had never once asked him to prove a thing. Then he spoke calmly, as though the answer had been obvious all along. "I will ride," he said, "but not before someone shows me where that horse actually went." The wind shifted through the square again, carrying the smell of sun-warmed dust and the uneasy realization that the story Dry Creek wanted to believe was no longer the only one standing in the street. The wind moved slowly across the square as Ethan Caldwell's words settled over Dry Creek like dust after a passing wagon. For a moment nobody spoke. The townspeople stood. They're studying him the way ranchers study a storm building along the far horizon, unsure yet whether it will pass quietly or change the whole day. Victor Hale's jaw tightened just slightly, though he tried to hide it beneath the calm authority he had worn in this town for years. "You are not in a position to ask questions here," Victor said, his voice carrying the steady tone of a man used to being obeyed. Ethan did not look away. "Anyone is in a position to ask questions when a life is on the line." The words did not sound like an argument. They sounded like a simple fact. That made them harder to dismiss. Sheriff Cole Harper rubbed his hand slowly along his beard as he looked between the two men. The sheriff had known Victor Hale for more than a decade. He had also spent enough years wearing a badge to recognize the moment when a situation stopped being simple. "Where did the horse go missing exactly?" Ethan asked again, calm and patient. Victor hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "North pasture, near the creek bend." Ethan nodded once as if storing the detail away. Then he turned his gaze toward the edge of the crowd where several ranch hands stood, shifting uncomfortably under the growing weight of attention. "Anyone here see the tracks?" he asked. No one answered at first. Boots scraped quietly against the packed dirt street. The men near the back exchanged glances but kept their hats low. Dry Creek was not a place where people liked standing against the man who owned the most land around it. Victor Hale noticed that silence too, and his voice sharpened slightly. "My men already told the sheriff what they saw." Ethan tilted his head. "Then it should not be hard to show it." The crowd murmured again, softer this time. Something about the request felt reasonable even to those who had arrived that morning already convinced of the girl's guilt. Sheriff Harper shifted again and finally spoke. Tracks would settle this quick enough. Victor's eyes flicked toward the sheriff for a moment. It was a small look, but Ethan noticed it. So did a few others in the square. You are wasting everyone's time, Victor said. That girl was the only stranger near the fence. Ethan's voice remained steady. Being near a fence does not put a saddle on a horse. A few people near the saloon porch gave quiet chuckles before quickly hiding them. Victor's expression hardened. He had expected the town to move quickly that morning. The matter finished before the sun climbed high enough to heat the streets. Instead, the cowboy standing in front of him had slowed the entire machine of certainty that Dry Creek relied on. Ethan finally stepped forward one pace, his boots pressing fresh marks into the dust of the square. Let us ride out and look, he said calmly. If the tracks lead away with her, then I will saddle my own horse and help you escort her out of town myself. The crowd listened closely now. Even the wind seemed to ease as if waiting for Victor Hale's answer. Ethan continued, his voice level and unhurried. But if the tracks lead somewhere else, he said, then Dry Creek deserves to know where the truth actually rides. And for the first time that morning, Victor Hale did not answer right away. Victor Hale's silence stretched across the square long enough for everyone to notice it. The wind pushed a thin wave of dust through Dry Creek, brushing against boots and wagon wheels while the town waited for the man who usually had an answer ready before anyone finished asking the question. Sheriff Cole Harper watched him carefully now, his brow furrowing slightly beneath the brim of his hat. For years, Victor Hale had spoken with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of land around the north pasture, every fence line, every bend of the creek. Yet at this moment, he seemed to be measuring something else entirely. The crowd shifted again, less certain than before. A ranch hand near the edge of the square cleared his throat and glanced toward the ground, as though hoping someone else would speak first. Ethan Caldwell did not move. He stood exactly where he had been, hands resting easy near his belt, his posture calm, but steady in the center of the growing tension. Tracks do not lie, he said quietly, more as a reminder than a challenge. If the horse left that pasture with her, the dirt will remember. Victor finally let out a short breath through his nose and forced a thin smile that did not quite reach his eyes. You speak like a man who has spent time trailing cattle, he said. Enough to know the land keeps its own record, Ethan replied. The sheriff nodded slowly at that, then turned toward the gathered ranch hands. Did any of you follow the tracks this morning? He asked. The men looked at each other. One of them shifted his hat back and answered carefully. We saw prints near the fence, Sheriff. But we did not ride far. Mr. Hale said we already knew what happened. A murmur moved through the crowd again, softer but sharper this time. Sheriff Harper's eyes drifted back toward Victor Hale, and the silence between them held longer than either man expected. Ethan noticed it too. He glanced toward the road that led north out of town, where the pale dirt trail wound past the pasture and followed the narrow bend of the creek for nearly half a mile before disappearing into low hills dotted with juniper and dry grass. It is about 15 minutes by horseback, Ethan said calmly. Less if we ride light. The sheriff rubbed his jaw again. He had hoped the morning would end quickly with a simple decision that satisfied the town. But now the idea of ignoring the tracks felt heavier than the trouble of looking for them. All right, he said finally. We ride out and see what the ground says. The words moved through the square like the turning of a key in a locked door. Some people nodded. Others frowned. Victor Hale's smile faded completely for a moment before returning in a tighter shape. If that is what it takes to quiet the noise, he said. Ethan glanced toward the platform again. Ayanna Redbird still stood there, silent and steady, her eyes following the exchange with the quiet patience of someone who had spent most of her life waiting for strangers to decide her fate. Ethan tipped his hat toward her once. Then he looked back at the sheriff. No need to keep her standing there while we ride, he said. Sheriff Harper hesitated only a moment before nodding. Miss Redbird will wait inside the office, he said. As two deputies stepped forward to guide her away from the platform, the crowd slowly parted to make space. And while most eyes followed the movement, Ethan Caldwell noticed something else entirely. Victor Hale had turned briefly toward the north road, studying the direction of the pasture. With a look that lasted only a second, but said more than any words spoken that morning. The horses were saddled within minutes, the sharp metallic sound of stirrups and buckles carrying through the quiet streets of Dry Creek as the small riding party gathered near the hitching rail outside the sheriff's office. Sheriff Cole Harper swung into his saddle first with the slow care of a man who had ridden many miles in his life, but preferred fewer of them these days. Ethan Caldwell mounted beside him without a word, his movements smooth and unhurried, the kind that came from years spent in open country where a man learned patience from the land itself. Victor Hale climbed onto his own horse last. His ranch was less than 3 miles north of town, and normally he would have ridden there with easy confidence. Today his shoulders looked a little stiffer beneath his coat, though most people watching would not have noticed. A handful of townsfolk followed on horseback, curiosity stronger than caution. Others remained in the square, watching the riders move out toward the pale trail that led across the dry flats. The road north curved gently past scattered fence posts and patches of tall grass that had survived the summer heat. Hoofbeats drummed softly against the dirt as the group rode in silence for nearly half a mile. The morning sun had climbed higher now, turning the distant hills a pale gold beneath the wide Arizona sky. Ethan rode slightly ahead of the others, studying the ground the way a man studies a map he trusts more than any words spoken in town. After another few minutes the pasture fence came into view. It was a long stretch of weathered rails that followed the curve of the creek where the water cut a narrow green line through the otherwise dusty land. Sheriff Harper slowed his horse and raised a hand. "This is the place," he said. Victor Hale nodded quickly. "Right near the bend." The riders dismounted one by one, boots landing softly on the ground as they began scanning the dirt around the fence line. At first it looked like any other stretch of pasture that had seen horses and cattle for years. Tracks overlapped everywhere. Hoofprints pressed into the dry earth at different angles, some fresh, others faded by wind and time. One of the ranch hands pointed toward a set of deeper marks near the fence. "There," he said. "Horse came through this gap." Sheriff Harper stepped closer and studied the ground. Ethan crouched beside the tracks without speaking. He brushed aside a thin layer of dust with the edge of his glove and followed the marks slowly for several feet. The others watched him quietly now, the earlier confidence of the crowd replaced by careful attention. Ethan finally stood and looked toward the direction the tracks led. They moved away from the pasture exactly as expected for about 20 yards. Then something changed. Ethan took a few steps farther along the trail, his boots crunching lightly against the dry soil. The hoofprints turned slightly, angling away from the open prairie. Instead of heading toward the road that led to town, they pointed toward a narrow cut between two low ridges where scrub brush grew thicker. Ethan studied the ground again, then glanced back toward the others. Sheriff Harper followed his gaze. "That does not lead to Dry Creek," the sheriff said slowly. Ethan shook his head. "No," Victor Hale spoke quickly from behind them. "Tracks can twist around anywhere in pasture land." But Ethan had already knelt again beside another set of marks just beyond the first. These were different, smaller. Boot prints pressed beside the hoof tracks, clear enough to show the pattern of a heel. Ethan ran his hand lightly above the dirt without touching it, studying the direction they traveled. Then he stood and looked back toward Victor Hale. "You said the only stranger near this pasture was Iona Redbird," he said calmly. The wind moved through the tall grass beside the creek, bending the blades in a slow wave. Ethan nodded once toward the boot prints beside the horse tracks. "These are not her tracks." And for the second time that morning the land itself had begun telling a story Dry Creek did not expect. The riders stood in quiet concentration around the narrow bend of the creek as Ethan Caldwell studied the prints in the dust a moment longer before slowly rising to his feet. The wind brushed across the pasture again, carrying the faint smell of water and dry grass while the group of men waited for someone to speak. Sheriff Cole Harper stepped closer and leaned down to look again at the marks Ethan had pointed out. The sheriff had spent most of his life riding across this county, and he knew the ground well enough to recognize the difference between a guess and a fact. He traced the line of the smaller boot prints with his eyes and frowned slightly. "Those steps are heavier than hers would be," he said quietly. One of the ranch hands shifted uneasily and scratched the back of his neck. "Maybe she walked with someone," the man suggested without much confidence. Ethan shook his head slowly. "These tracks were here before the horse left the pasture," he said. "See how the heel cuts deeper toward the front of the print. Whoever made them was already standing here waiting. The sheriff followed the direction Ethan indicated and nodded reluctantly. The marks showed exactly what the cowboy described. The person had been standing near the gap in the fence long enough for the soil to compress beneath the boots. After that, the hoofprints appeared. Then the two sets moved together toward the narrow cut between the ridges. Victor Hale crossed his arms and looked down at the ground with a tight expression. "You are reading too much from dirt," he said. "Pastures collect tracks all the time." Ethan met his gaze without raising his voice. "Tracks do collect, but they do not line up like this unless someone meant them to." The others began walking slowly along the direction the prints led, following the faint path toward the brush-filled cut between the low hills. The ground changed slightly there, the soil becoming softer where occasional rainwater washed down from the rocks above. That made the prints clearer. Sheriff Harper stopped again after only a few yards and crouched near the edge of the trail. "There is another mark here," he said. The men gathered around him. Half buried in the dirt lay a small piece of leather strap, weathered but freshly torn from something larger. One of the ranch hands picked it up carefully and turned it over in his fingers. Ethan studied it quietly. "That is part of a bridle strap," he said. The ranch hand looked toward Victor Hale almost automatically. Most of the horses grazing in the north pasture belonged to Victor's ranch, and the style of leatherwork was easy to recognize. Victor's jaw tightened again. "Plenty of tack looks like that," he replied quickly. But the sheriff's eyes had moved beyond the strap now. He was staring farther down the trail where the hoofprints and boot marks continued deeper into the brush. Ethan followed his gaze. The tracks did not turn back toward Dry Creek. They did not circle around the pasture either. They kept moving forward into the narrow pass where the ridges closed together like a gate. Sheriff Harper slowly stood and dusted his hands against his trousers. "If the horse was taken toward town," he said carefully, "these tracks should be heading south." Ethan nodded once and looked toward the direction the prints continued. "Instead, they are heading north," he said quietly. The wind rustled through the tall grass beside the creek again as the truth began settling over the group one piece at a time. And behind them, Victor Hale remained very still beside his horse, watching the trail ahead with a look that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with worry. The riders followed the trail deeper into the narrow pass where the two low ridges pressed closer together and the ground grew softer beneath scattered patches of shade. The hoofprints and boot marks continued clearly now, the path etched into the earth as though the land itself wanted to finish telling the story that had begun back in Dry Creek. Sheriff Cole Harper walked ahead slowly, studying every mark with a careful eye, while the ranch hands followed a few steps behind with quiet unease settling into their expressions. No one spoke for several minutes. Even the horses tied near the entrance of the pass seemed unusually still beneath the bright Arizona sky. Ethan Caldwell finally stopped beside a cluster of scrub brush where the trail curved around a small rise. He knelt once more and brushed aside a layer of loose sand, revealing the deeper impression of a horse turning sharply before continuing north. The boot prints paused there too, circling once in the dirt as though the rider had taken time adjusting the tack. Sheriff Harper stepped beside him and studied the ground with a long, thoughtful look. "Whoever took that horse knew exactly where he was going," the sheriff said quietly. Ethan nodded and stood again, his eyes drifting toward the far end of the pass where the trail widened into a hidden pocket of land sheltered between the hills. A small corral sat there, half concealed by the rise, its wooden rails old but recently repaired. One of the ranch hands pointed toward it slowly. "That pen belongs to the North Ridge grazing lot," he said. The men began walking toward it, boots crunching softly against gravel as the truth came closer with every step. When they reached the corral, the horse stood calmly inside, reins tied to the rail exactly the way a ranch hand would secure an animal during a quick stop. Sheriff Harper leaned against the fence and let out a long breath. "Well," he said quietly, "that settles where the horse ended up." Ethan rested one hand on the top rail and studied the ground around the pen. The same boot prints circled the corral before heading back out toward the ridge trail that led west away from Dry Creek. He glanced over his shoulder toward Victor Hale, who had followed behind the others more slowly than before. The rancher's face had grown pale beneath the brim of his hat. Sheriff Harper turned to him with a steady look. "You said the horse was taken toward town," the sheriff said. Victor did not answer immediately. The wind brushed through the brush behind them, carrying the faint creak of the corral gate. Finally, Victor cleared his throat and tried to force a calm tone into his voice. "Looks like someone hid it here," he said. Ethan met the sheriff's eyes for a moment and then nodded toward the ground again. "Someone who knew the pasture," he said quietly. The ranch hands exchanged uneasy glances. Sheriff Harper straightened slowly and brushed the dust from his palms. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he looked back toward the entrance of the pass where the trail to Dry Creek waited beneath the bright morning sun. "We should head back," he said. "The town deserves to hear what the land had to say." An hour later the riders returned to the square where the people of Dry Creek still lingered beneath the wooden porches and hitching posts, waiting for the answer they had expected to be simple. Ayanna Redbird stood quietly outside the sheriff's office where the deputies had asked her to wait. When Ethan dismounted, he tipped his hat toward her once again before turning toward the gathered crowd. Sheriff Harper stepped forward beside him and spoke clearly enough for every person in the square to hear. "The horse was never taken toward town," he said. A ripple moved through the crowd as heads turned toward Victor Hale. The rancher stood stiffly beside his horse with no easy explanation left to offer. The wind carried silence through the square again before Ethan Caldwell finally swung back into his saddle. He glanced once more toward Ayanna, then toward the road stretching beyond Dry Creek's dusty edge. "Looks like the truth found its way after all," he said quietly. And as the town slowly absorbed what had happened, the cowboy guided his horse toward the open road while the morning sun rose higher above the quiet roofs of Dry Creek.